Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. And I'm just going to give a short introduction to the next session. The next session we've titled Realms, and I'll start with this quick quip by Jeff Manna. What landscape futures might we explore when entire terrains are internally mechanized, given partial sentience, and able to interact with one another wirelessly over great distances of time and space? Landscape architecture has promoted a dialogue that defines a disciplinary authenticity reliant on the dirt, plants, and physical materials of the profession. While there is truth in this, we are being confronted with a computational reality, one that hinges upon a landscape enmeshed in digital and analog spaces. What has evolved is an alternate space, accessible through databases and simulations that create the justification and capability to assess landscape conditions, propose goals, and using responsive technologies. Currently, we are influencing and shaping the landscape at various scales and velocities. Examples are seen at the planetary scale in the domestication of flora and fauna, at the continental scale through infrastructural operation and ecological maintenance, and at the territorial scale through contemporary agriculture. There is a complexity to the anthropogenic influence on ecological systems that ranges far beyond the scale of human interactions or intent. These are intertwined in our evolving perceptions of natural systems and the wild, while new fields of innovation and areas of application are emerging, presenting strategies for synthetic biologies, cybernetic and robotic ecology, and geoengineering. For this session, Earl Ellis will be moderating. He's a professor of geography and environmental systems at the University of Maryland and the director of the Laboratory of Anthropogenic Landscape Ecology. His research examines the ecology of anthropogenic landscapes and their change across scales, with 3 areas of focus: anthropogenic biomes, tools for synthesizing local knowledge and landscape change, and inexpensive methods of mapping and managing ecological change in anthropogenic landscapes. Recently, his work has focused on human societies as a global force that is transforming the biosphere. This has been through the development of theories in anthroecology and sociocultural niche construction. Our presenters are Rob Holmes. He's an assistant professor at Auburn University, co-founder of the Dredge Research Collaborative, and co-author of the blog Mammoth. He is currently working on the Four Coasts Project, exploring the role of sediment as an infrastructural element in North America. His work focuses on how control systems and infrastructure support and shape urbanization through change. Kathy Velikov is an associate professor at the Taubman College of Architecture and Planning at the University of Michigan. She is a founding principal of RTVR, a research-based practice that examines the interfaces between urban design within the context of dynamic ecological systems. Recently, she was one of the organizers of the Acadia Conference, entitled Post-Human Frontiers, Data, Designers, and Cognitive Machines, and was part of the team that designed and implemented the Canadian Pavilion, entitled Extraction, at the 2016 Venice Architecture Biennale. Liam Young is an architect that explores speculative futures through media and fiction. With his think tank, Tomorrow's Thoughts Today, he works to develop propositions that explore the speculative and imaginary futures of urban space. He is currently running the fiction and entertainment group at SciArc and has been acclaimed in a range of academic, architectural, and mainstream media. First, Rob Holmes.
All right, so I recently finished reading this series of books by Jeff Vandermeer called the Southern Reach Trilogy. Although I don't want to spoil them for anyone who hasn't read them, I do think I can say without spoiling too much about them that one of the things they're kind of centrally concerned with is the relationship between a human and the other, and in particular, what it means for people to come into kind of extreme contact with things which are not human, the non-human. I think I don't really know what Jeff Vandermeer was reading when he was writing the books, but I think they fit very well into this kind of contemporary moment where we're talking a lot about the dissolution of nature under the kind of traditional terms that we've understood it, kind of thinking about ideas about like what it's like to experience wilderness after nature, or what a post-natural world is, or what ecology without nature is like. And one of the things that the series does that's really interesting to me is it kind of makes this inversion of contamination. So I think usually when we think about contamination taking place between humans and the natural world, we think of kind of humans polluting and contaminating the natural world. And one of the things that the book does is it actually flips that around, and it kind of presents the natural world contaminating humans. So it starts to describe people in this very unusual way, where it actually like talks about people as if they're almost like the subject of a PBS nature documentary or something. So a person whose jacket is wedded to him like a beetle's carapace, or a person whose head swivels around like a cat following the flight of a bird. The trilogy gets its title, The Southern Reach, from the name of this kind of extremely incompetent agency called the Southern Reach that's been tasked with investigating Area X. So Area X is this kind of portion of Florida, Florida's Forgotten Coast, as it's called. It's kind of like the muddy space between like Pensacola and Tampa, so kind of between the beaches, this swampy, muddy region. And the weird thing that's happened to Area X that kind of sets the series in motion is that there's been this exclusion. So like something has happened, it's not really clear what, and all of the evidence, trace, activities, presence of humans has disappeared. So like down to kind of the molecular level, there's no trace whatsoever of humans left in Area X. And I think this is really weird and interesting because it's, I think it's only now in this kind of post-natural cultural moment that we would think of something like people being gone as being eerie and problematic in kind of like the way that it could form the central conceit of a series of novels that, if they're not horror, they're at least kind of like on the border between science fiction and horror. But I think this is where we are. And I think it's not coincidental at all that this moment is the moment in which we find ourselves assembling to discuss robot landscape architecture. Well, unlike most or maybe even everyone else who's speaking today, I don't really do any work with robots or sensors or computation. But I have been thinking a lot about the behavior of large-scale landscape systems. And in particular, I think what's relevant here is the work that I've been doing to think about what wilderness might mean, particularly what wilderness might mean in an American context after nature. So there's kind of three things I want to do briefly. One of them is to suggest some kind of alternate definition for wilderness that maybe robots fit a little better into. I'd like to talk about one particular tendency within these kinds of landscapes, or these kinds of landscape systems, that I think actually points the way towards why robot wilderness might be something that we actually want to cultivate and to encourage. And in particular, I want to talk about that in a way that reveals something that I think Brad hinted at this, at least implicitly in his initial comments. It's come up in some of the first panel, but why that necessity might really be not so much a technical necessity as a political necessity. So first, this definition. Traditionally, wilderness has been defined by the absence of human influence, but I would argue that given the pervasive scale of human influence across the globe, a better contemporary definition would focus on the absence of human control. So that first definition, the definition that's about the absence of influence, is kind of the one that environmental historians talk about when they describe the wilderness ideal as this kind of key concept that underlies American self-definition. It's the kind of wilderness idea that old dead people like Thoreau and Muir and Leopold are famous for talking about. So you could think of like Thoreau saying, "In wildness is the preservation of the world." It also, I think, has informed landscape architecture to a large degree. You could think of work like Ian McHarg, where you're kind of trying to preserve some kind of nature as other against the presence of human development. It's embedded in dictionary definitions. So if you go to the dictionary and look for what wilderness is, it's going to tell you that it's uncultivated, it's uninhabited, it's undisturbed. If you go to the American legal system and look at the Wilderness Act, which is where that was kind of legally codified for the first time, it will say that wilderness is something that retains its primeval character and influence. It generally appears to have been affected primarily by the forces of nature, with the imprint of man's work substantially unnoticeable. But I think, and I could set out a longer version of this argument, but I don't think it's necessary in this context, that when we look at kind of the scale of human influence over environmental processes globally, that this kind of definition that depends on the absence of influence really breaks down and fails. This is a diagram that I made extracted from some of Earl's data, kind of pulling out the wildlands, which were like the two categories in the version 2 Anthrome's data that are kind of described as not under human influence. And so the land that's kind of left, if you look for a definition of wilderness that's based on the absence of human influence, is like the Arctic, the Sahara, part of the Amazon, some isolated mountain ranges, some jungles, some deserts. And really, I think if you kind of take a more geochemical or biogeochemical process-oriented view, these are often the places that are actually kind of where you can see the impact of human activities in terms of things like climate change most rapidly, most readily. So what I'd like to suggest is that there might be another way of thinking about wilderness. We could have another way of thinking about it that doesn't depend so much on the absence of influence. And one of the things that I read that was really helpful to me in formulating this was this book called Next Nature by a pair of Dutch thinkers that kind of makes the charge that the way that Westerners have historically conceived of nature, presently conceive of nature, is dependent on kind of a Roman understanding of what nature is, where nature was really associated with everything that's born. So if it's born and not made, then it's nature. But they noted there's also this kind of slightly earlier Greek notion that was more about growth. And so under the Greek understanding, nature was really more something that is kind of self-generative, that's capable of growing and changing, could be understood as nature. So they make a diagram that looks like this, that has born and made, those two kind of oppositions within the Roman understanding on one axis, has controlled and beyond control, kind of the two oppositions that are more within the Greek understanding on the other axis. And I kind of changed it up so that instead of talking about nature, it's talking about wilderness, and think that what's really interesting maybe now is to consider landscapes that might fall into this category of being made but beyond control. So not necessarily born, so they're not without human influence, but they're nonetheless truly wild in the sense of being beyond human control. So sometimes this might be a real landscape, sometimes it might be a system, so it could be something like an algorithmic system that kind of has its own kind of behavior, independent of the human control. It could be landscapes like the landscapes that a lot of my work has focused on, like the movement or choreography of sediment at a regional scale, where the kind of the array and variety of actors implicated in that activity, the kind of material unpredictability of the sediment being moved, and the sheer scale of the system lends it a kind of emergent wildness or emergent capacity to grow and change. And I think it would certainly also apply to any kind of conceivable robot wilderness, right? So like back in July, there was this interview with Brad that was published where Brad says, if we haven't really manufactured it and it's a place we don't actually understand how it completely works because it's this other computational thing making it, it's almost wilderness. The genesis is human construction, but the actual actions are computational logics. And I would agree with that entirely, except that I would say that it's not almost wilderness, it's actually wild. So What I do want to say, though, is what being uncontrolled is not meaning that it has no logic imbued in it initially, and it doesn't mean that it wasn't created under conditions of control, but rather that typically through kind of the repetitive implementation of many different operations that share a kind of coherent logic. We could think of them as being like batch operations in the same sense that you have within computational systems. That it has the capacity for real emergence, that this kind of landscape, this kind of system has the capacity to truly exceed our control, to do things that we didn't intend it to do, even if it hasn't done that yet. So I'd say like kind of a failure of control is not a requisite for something being beyond control. It doesn't have to have exploded or failed or kind of become a disaster for it to have this capacity. It's merely the fact that it has the capacity that makes it wild. All right, so one of the things that's really interesting and fertile, I guess, about a system that's organized through batch operations, that organized through the kind of repetitive implementation of a logic or a protocol, is that you have the capacity to organize and configure systems at a much larger scale, I think, with much greater efficiency, or potentially much more responsively than you do within kind of the logic of a bespoke or individual series of design operations. But at the same time, I think one of the things that's potentially kind of a potential pitfall within that capacity is that you have the potential for very small misalignments, maybe misalignments that are even invisible to the original designer, between the logic or the kind of protocol embedded in the operation and the world to kind of rapidly cascade and cause problems that are very difficult to foresee. So back in 2011, architect Kazis Varnelis gave a talk in Barcelona that was called A Manifesto for Looseness. And in it, he was looking in part at the work of the sociologist Charles Perrow and was kind of trying to understand how complex systems might kind of carry this capacity for misalignment within themselves. So he said, within these kind of complex systems, when we add all these logics or all these kind of embedded protocols together, we can achieve remarkable levels of efficiency. The result is that these systems, because they are so integrated, can fail in unpredictable ways. 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, Fukushima, the Challenger disaster, the Columbia disaster. You can't blame the operator, you have to blame the complexity designed into the system itself. So I think we could say that a complex system, which this kind of wilderness would certainly be an example of, is kind of prone to this tendency towards what Manuel Delanda refers to in the Intro to 1,000 Years of Nonlinear History, and referring back to complex systems theory, refers to as a bifurcation. So kind of the potential for a system to switch from one steady state to another at this kind of critical point very rapidly and be triggered by kind of minor fluctuations, so that it's not necessarily immediately obvious from the outside what kind of action or what point might trigger that switch. But when it happens, it can be kind of rapid and even total. So I think these kinds of systems, these kinds of landscapes, it would be fair to say that they're prone to becoming rapidly far from equilibrium. And as just like one very quick example of this, for the past 8 years, there have been these algae blooms in China. They're kind of spectacular in scale, particularly when they arrive on the coast. They've been described as large-scale algae disasters. I think the largest one covered something like 500,000 square miles offshore, not onshore. This kind of thing, so that when you have kind of large-scale algae blooms, they're typically attributed to nutrient pollution. So typically the idea is that you have some source like a sewer system or agriculture that's sending nutrients, and that's triggering the growth of algae. In this case, it's believed that what's actually happening is that south of that portion of the coast, there are nori farms, seaweed farms, where they're growing seaweed in the water, and it's actually cultivating that algae. When they harvest it, it actually ends up moving up the coast and kind of reproducing and forming these enormous mats. So in that case, I think what's really interesting is that if you had a few nori farms, it would probably have no real visible or discernible impact. But when you have $500 million worth of nori farms cultivating all at once, kind of all operating according to the same logic, all aligned with one another, it kind of accumulates and triggers this massive change in the sea or in the ocean off the coast. So I think if we're going to talk about constructing computational landscapes, if we're going to talk about embedding computational logic into them, we do need to ask ourselves, where might aggregated behavior cascade into perverse results? Where do behaviors that are rational in isolation become collectively irrational? And what are the dangers in assuming that everything goes according to plan? I think designers in general tend to be very bad futurists. We tend to kind of assume that things are going to proceed in a linear way, and that they're going to follow. Oh, yeah, my picture disappeared. So that things are going to proceed in a linear way, and we don't necessarily do a good job of accounting for the potential of futures to be much less neat, to spread in multiple ways, that you might have roughly equal possibilities of different things happening, or that you might have accidents occur. I think if you think back to kind of what you might call the process discourse within landscape architecture, or kind of the rhetoric that's occurred in recent decades around indeterminacy and flux, there's this tendency to divide or kind of make a bifurcation between either the landscape is determined or it's indeterminate. And in reality, all landscapes actually kind of exist in this probabilistic terrain between indeterminacy and determinacy that can be probed, that can actually be investigated if we're careful, if we develop tools for rigorously investigating the future and going beyond just thinking about what's likely to considering the range of possibilities. One of the things that I think is really important about this, about kind of thinking about the future in terms of multiplicity rather than in terms of a kind of linear fashion, is that it actually doesn't just kind of help us guard against this danger, but it actually opens us up to a new range of values. If you're going to think about designing landscapes in terms of multiplicity, you're necessarily going to accommodate a range of values. So you're open to productive excesses, you're open to the kind of agency of many different actors, both human and non-human. And I think it helps us to kind of move past a reductive logic of efficiency that I think often gets embedded into technical systems. And as Brad noted, is kind of one of the key dangers within this kind of work is that you might be hostage to that logic of efficiency. A logic that I think not only has the tendency to exclude landscape architecture and design, as it kind of tends to do within most industrial or logistical systems, but also has the potential to really be misaligned in fundamental ways with the world as it exists. So I think this is where, when you start to talk about what are the values of a design project, or what should we value and why should we value it and how much we should we value it, that's where I think this kind of goes from being a technical project to ultimately a political project. And so I'd like to close really quickly by offering a few different ways in which I think robot wilderness might actually be necessary and not just something that we need to be careful about making. So the first is kind of a scale that it has the capacity to generate landscape. Landscapes are already being generated through batch operations, through the organization of protocols at a scale that far exceeds the capacity of bespoke design operations. Another is that, as George Monbiot says in this book, recently released book called Feral, he talks about the idea that many people in this day and age might be suffering from a kind of ecological boredom, and that that there's actually a kind of experiential necessity to wildness, to things that are not entirely safe. I also think, as I hinted at with the talk about the process discourse, that there's a kind of methodological necessity to this, that this kind of work or these kinds of landscape systems have the potential to be truly open and to generate real novelty in a way that's methodologically valuable. But for me, the most interesting and important one has to do with ethics. So it's that kind of, right, so a lot of ethics, a lot of philosophical ethics kind of starts from first principles and tends to say, like, you have something like Kant and the categorical imperative, and you say that we're going to kind of reason our way into what ethics is and how we should behave towards one another. And one of my favorite philosophers is this guy, Emmanuel Levinas, who says that that's really not an adequate place to start ethics, that ethics needs to begin actually with encounter. So he says that the other faces me and puts me in question and obliges me. So he says that really that's the starting point of ethics, is this kind of moment where you encounter the other. And when he talks about the other, he's talking primarily about humans. So when you encounter another human, but I think it's very easy to kind of translate that into also speaking about our responsibility to the world outside of ourselves and kind of the necessity of encounter with the other. As for me, ultimately being a necessary precondition for any kind of democratic self-governance of the Anthropocene, which to me is probably the most important project that any of us could be engaged with at this point. So I guess in closing, I'll say, I think if we're going to value the wild and we're going to make wise collective decisions about it, then we are going to have to recognize and encounter it.
Okay. Well, that actually sort of leads into the talk I'm going to give quite nicely. So I'm going to start by saying thank you. Thank you for the invitation and the pleasure to share some thoughts and some work as part of this conference. I'm an associate professor at the University of Michigan Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning and partner in the practice RVTR. Our work oscillates between that of material systems that explore composite material surfaces imbued with intelligence, complex functions, kinetic action, and interaction. And we also work with large-scale infrastructure and landscape-based visualization and speculations that engage environmental, technological, and political geographies and their possible architectures. So this afternoon, I'm going to take on the prompt of a realm as a kind of lens to offer 4 episodic glimpses or instances into projects that I hope will kind of come together. And I say hope because this is the first time I've put these particular works and ideas together into a talk, so we'll see how it goes. But my sense is that before we can start talking about the kind of large-scale environmental management, robotic landscapes, I'd like to step back and offer some thoughts on environmental and geographic consciousness and aesthetics as mediated by technologies and devices. And so I want to start with the idea of dissonance, of a kind of dissonance that exists between a thing like the environment, which is dissipated, unbounded, unspeakably variable, formless, almost incomprehensible, and then between ourselves, physically bounded, formed, enveloped, seemingly finite. So how do we work through this dissonance? How do we find ways to internalize the inaccessible of the environment, and in this way start to develop a practice of environmental sensibility, and I think, as Rob put it very nicely, kind of an environmental ethics? Lately, I've been thinking a lot about this essay written by Walter Benjamin, which is called On Language as Such and on the Language of Man. So in this piece, Benjamin writes that much of artistic practice is founded on languages issuing from matter. and that an aspect of aesthetic practice involves the translation of these thing languages into a shared dialect between people and things. This translation in form, even more than in content, remains a deeply political practice. And this, in many ways, is the principal interest that I've had behind a lot of my work and teaching, and behind the way that I've been trying to use sensing and communication technologies and devices in kind of hybrid collisions between matter and environmental forces to explore aesthetic and cognitive relations with our milieu. So the first project I'm going to show is called Nervous Ether, Shiver of Bodies. It was an installation that we ran as a workshop a few years ago at the California College of the Arts that experimented with developing a material and cognitive dialogue between built form, humans, and the atmosphere. It used a fairly rudimentary Firefly algorithm connected to pneumatic solenoid valves to translate live environmental data streams such as barometric pressure and wind speed into a material language of pneumatic breathing cells, and they move in very almost imperceptible ways but you can see them moving. These cells would pulse, expand, contract, and relax relative to the atmospheric inputs, operating as a kind of Hertzian register. Nervous Ether also integrated human interaction within the system. As visitors approached close to the structure, a series of motion sensor-controlled cells would suddenly fill with air and move perpendicularly outward, like hairs standing on a person's skin, making it a kind of anxious surface. The material language of pneumatics, we speculated, would be a suitable one for translating the matter of the atmosphere, as pneumatics have long been used as instruments for registering atmospherics. The installation's title, Nervous Ether, is derived from the history of physics, wherein philosophers and scientists have speculated on the existence of a nervous ether, a material atmosphere that is the conductor of vibrations of heat, light, sound, electromagnetic impulses, and mechanical frictions. And in the late 19th century, the physicist John Tyndall theorized that the transported shiver of bodies, and that's his quote, of the cosmos and the stars could be intimately felt within our own physical bodies and consciousnesses. And I really like this idea that through a language of shivering and shuddering, we might be able to find a kind of connection between the atmosphere and our physical bodies. And more recently, philosopher Michel Serres has argued that we inhabit a kind of informational weather, which is volatile and intermingled. And so within the contemporary context of the kind of data oceans that can be registered, collected, communicated via the increasing ubiquity of sensing and control devices, we can speculate perhaps once again, as Tyndall did, on the material embodiment of information. And this brings me to a brief note on language and cognition. And the contemporary data environment, which immerses us within a constant milieu of informational knowledge and representation, these kind of explicit symbols, forms of writing, governed by logic, organization, analytics, and foregrounded through the various screens and interfaces we constantly interact with, are kind of part of our current reality. But I'm also interested in a different kind of knowledge production, one that my good colleague and media scholar Malcolm McCullough refers to as implicit knowledge. And he argues that the contemporary urban milieu, characterized by oceans of digital information flows and clouds of ambient data, can also foster forms of implicit or tacit information processing that are cognitively different from the semantic empiricist knowledge that we are working with as the primary way of working with this data and information. And then this knowledge is acquired through the body rather than through the mind, and occurs through physiological processes within specific situations. And I think that both of these types of knowledge need to be cultivated, and while we are very immersed and becoming quite good at translating the media of empiricist knowledge through texts, maps, charts, graphs, and we do a lot of these in our practice as well, I would argue that implicit knowledge is also very necessary, if not crucial. And so this comes to the second episode in the talk. While the Nervous Ether Project was interested in translating the realms of air and atmosphere, we in our practice have been involved on another project that has been working on mediating the inaccessible realms of the ground. And for the past couple of years, we've been working with a team of archaeologists who have been undertaking a geophysical survey in preparation for eventual excavations of an ancient Ionian city on the Aegean coast of present-day Turkey, or at what was at that time known as Asia Minor, and then this is the kind of ancient city. And this is actually, paleogeographically, this site is super interesting because this entire landscape here is all sedimentation from the past 3,000 years, where when the city was active, the port, actually they docked the ships back here, and we have yet to do core samples to really understand where the water actually was, but that's what is believed. Anyway, it's probably a bit premature to show this project as there's been no design work completed or ready for prime time yet. But I wanted to show some of the preliminary investigations in the context of this talk, because the work has entailed an extensive survey of surface and subsurface imaging in order to understand as much about the ancient city and what may be buried beneath the surface prior to starting excavation or planning the archaeological park. Besides conventional surveying, the team that we've been working with has been using drone imaging, and that's someone launching the drone, to create a 3-centimeter point cloud of the entire site. So we can see right down to the stones on the surface while also creating a kind of very detailed 3D model. We've been using thermal imaging, which has to be done early in the morning when stone is much colder than the earth. And this has revealed some of the subsurface conditions that we cannot readily see with our eyes. We've also been working on imaging with a magnetic gradiometer that images changes in magnetic signatures close to the surface. And we can sense zones of different materials such as terracotta, metal, or even soil compaction. And then looking at these various forms of mediated images side by side, and these are pictures of the same area through the 3 different forms of seeing or sensing the ground, we can start to make out some of the subsurface of the city that is otherwise hidden to the eye, such as here where we see a kind of what might be an inconclusive arrangement of stones becomes far more clear as perhaps a road in the mag data. And then with the thermal data, we actually see very clearly that this is an intersection of streets. We've also found that the site, which first looks like a solid mass of limestone, is actually riddled with holes, and these are 3D laser scans of 8 of the cisterns that we have been able to locate and access on the site. And there's undoubtedly many more, probably one for every few houses that were built. And in reality, the archaeological excavation will only uncover a very small fraction of all this site, and a lot will stay buried beneath the surface. So as the designers of the archaeological park, my partners and I have been thinking about how we can communicate and translate into an experience the subsurface structures and spaces that will likely never be sensibly accessed by visitors. And I'll probably have to come back to talk about that in a couple of years. This is the 3rd episode, called Miniatures as Devices. Coming back to the question of thing languages, I've been very interested in the notion of the microcosm, or the miniature, as a kind of material instrument or device that can work to translate and embody scales of the earth and scales of territory. The Antikythera mechanism is the first known analog computer, and this is it actually at what they found as parts of it in the Athens Archaeological Museum, and then a more modern reconstruction. The artifact found is believed to have been constructed sometime between the 1st and 2nd centuries BC, although the technology for the mechanism itself is assumed to have been much older. The mechanism predicted multiple astronomical cycles simultaneously, tracking with precision, they believe, the elliptical lunar orbit, predicting the zodiac eclipses and other celestial events. It also mapped the times of the Olympic Games onto the temporal cycle, collapsing human time with that of the cosmos in a single device. And this kind of translation is something that I'm very interested in, and I like to think about when we work on questions of territory, how to translate things to the kind of scale of the human that are incomprehensible to us. And so this year, my partners and I at RVTR were invited by your own colleague and faculty, Pierre Bélanger, to collaborate on the installation for Extraction, the Canadian pavilion for the 2016 Venice Biennale. And while this project may probably be well known to many of you here, I'm not sure, I'm just going to touch on one small aspect of it, which was our challenge in the exhibition, and that is to create a kind of microcosm or miniature in order to translate and make accessible the almost incomprehensible scale and temporal scope of the geographies and politics of Canada's global empire of mineral extraction, and to turn this into a discrete experience at the Giardini. So while the Extraction project is a much broader multimedia endeavor, including a publication edited by Pierre and Nina Marie Lister, I'm going to only briefly speak about the installation part here. And the installation I would describe as a kind of spatio-political mappamundi, taking the kind of form of perhaps an enclosed garden. And so since the Canadian Pavilion, which is here on the map, was closed for renovations and we could not mount the exhibition inside it, Pierre actually convinced the Biennale authorities to allow us to install our exhibition as an open-air installation, kind of right here on the grounds of the Giardini. And the site is located at the top of the hill at the end of one of the axes. And there actually is a kind of found condition of a kind of proto-garden with the facades of the neoclassical pavilions for England, France, and Germany, kind of surrounding the site. And then there was also the Canadian Pavilion, which is a small one-story structure set back a little between Britain and Germany. So there's already a kind of politics, geopolitics happening on the site of the Giardini, which is pretty interesting. We decided as part of the installation to replace a part of this wall with a new wall, a wall of gold ore, or waste rock from gold mining to be more precise, creating a blockade in front of the Canadian Pavilion, a kind of new facade. The ore was brought up to Venice from a Canadian-owned mine in Ferté, Sardinia, which was left abandoned by the company in fairly toxic conditions with significant levels of acid mine drainage, which threatened the water supply and the agricultural region of the Caligari watershed. On axis with the imperial pavilions, we created a kind of proto-temenos, a low mound and map of the world at 1:1 billion scale. And in this picture, the map is actually covered in a shroud of beaver pelts because it's awaiting the inauguration ceremony. At the center of the map is a gold survey stake, the preeminent legal and technological instrument to mark, map, and territory. This was the instrument of the colonialists to mark and take ownership of Aboriginal land. And without the survey stake, there is no territory. At the center of the stake is an oculus, which visitors are invited to look through. And in order to look through the oculus, you have to kneel down and place your hands on the surface of the map, which is milled as an inverted map of the world. So you realize that this inverts your conventional position of looking at the world or looking at maps. Instead of being on top of the world, which you're used to being, you're actually underneath it, looking from below. And as you look in or back out, you see a film, which is 800 years of colonial history of extraction in 800 seconds. And the music that you hear and that vibrates through your hands is by the Aboriginal rap artist, rap band called A Tribe Called Red, and the title of the song is Burn Your Village to the Ground. And you realize that all this time you've been kneeling and bowing to the empires of France and England, who are complicit in this narrative of extraction. And so it is both a miniature, making something so vast and distant seem incredibly intimate, incredibly personal and visceral. It's also a highly political device, reorienting you within the world. And here's the Canadian ambassador to Italy kneeling and bowing to Britain at the inauguration ceremony. And the wall being used as a site of protest media. So now I'm going to come to the last part of my talk, where I'm going to turn briefly to some of my design studio teaching at the University of Michigan, where I've been focusing on questions of territory as well. But specifically, we've been working with students on what I've been terming territories of exclusion. And these are terrestrial geographies that have been excluded or expelled and quarantined from the world as a kind of result of anthropogenic violence. And these sites are no longer considered productive or humanly habitable, such as landscapes of extractions, sites of weapons testing, industrial environmental accidents, and such. And I've been specifically interested in having students work on these territories where the scale and extent of environmental disruption is just so great that you can't try to make a narrative of fixing it. You can't fix it through technological means. You can't import a narrative of rehabilitation. So how do you start to address these sites? How do you work on these sites? Such landscapes such as the open pit Empire Iron Mine in Michigan's Upper Peninsula that we went to last fall, which really, it's kind of, the scale of this really exposes the hubris of the enterprise of remediation in some cases. And so working in a landscape such as this demands that other forms of engagement and thinking about how design can play a role in the development of alternative cultural relationships within these sites. And I should say these are architects, not landscape architects, working on this question. So we try to approach it slightly more architecturally, I would say. And in these studios, we've been focusing on the idea of the garden, which I quite like, even though it might be a kind of quaint and perhaps discredited notion in the kind of operational landscapes of the past few years. But I like the garden because the garden, like the house or the city, is an archetypal societal construct that is really open for reimagination at each moment of civilization. And so it's a cultivated landscape that both excludes the world, because gardens often have boundaries, but also tries to reimagine it, and in many ways tries to understand it. It's another kind of microcosm. It is also the premier aesthetic device through which we express to ourselves our relationship between us and what we used to call nature. The act of gardening itself is also a practice of negotiation, a practice of cultivation and making relations, which I think is a very important practice to try to think about in relation to landscape. And however, since humans cannot easily inhabit or exist within these alien and hostile territories, we've been experimenting actually with inhabiting by means of sentient machines. So we have literally been designing robot landscapes, not with the goal of making them habitable, but with the desire to find new forms of relation and engagement altogether. And that's the role that these projects play. They're not real propositions, but they use narrative as a kind of way to tell stories to ourselves. So we can start to internalize and perhaps understand these territories through a different lens. So in Jaime Rivera's project on the screen, an extremophile garden starts to be cultivated in the abandoned Empire Mine. And it's not tended and cared for by humans, but by a new host of characters, a kind of community of semi-autonomous robotic entities that work to cultivate the terrain. And in this series of images, he imagines how these robotic entities might even start to develop affection and different kinds of relationships between these extreme landscapes, as well as their human counterparts, who obviously, due to the toxicity of the site, can only access them through mediated layers of technology. And we've also been working on the drawings themselves as ways to think about how to express these technologies of mediation. How does the space of the drawing become a place of this kind of sensibility? We've been very interested in the subjectivities that these inaccessible territories of exclusion might engender and try to explore these ideas through the projects and the drawings. So subjects that have emerged through the student projects are such as the environmental researcher or the explorer. So in Jen Ng's project, the subject is now trying to rediscover and chart these protean landscapes. Or in Mauricio Cornejo's project, that of the pilgrim, the eco-chemo tourist, to borrow the words of Peter Gallison, trying to kind of just find witness and explain to themselves these worlds within the world that we have created. And in Mauricio's project, An Ecology of Autonomous Robotic Entities inhabit a kind of post-catastrophe landscape somewhere near the Nevada test site in the Aral Sea. And here, these colonies of drones cultivate a landscape of strange biological garden, new species, new atmospheres, and also gather the information. But the information gathering never stops. They contribute to building a kind of perpetual construction of a massive archive to house these hordes of data. And it's a kind of landscape of a runaway construction and biotic ecology that kind of continues without us. But that still carries with it the memory of the violence that has occurred on the site. And in student Jennings' Aeriform Ecologies project, matter itself becomes an agent, and she's designed these scout and harvester drones that locate and collect petroleum emissions, byproducts from the atmosphere, and synthesize this airborne carbon dioxide into carbon nanotubes, creating a new types of matter that can be deposited in the form of aggregate geological spatial formations that have the capacity to be inhabited and explored. So although highly fictional, these explorations are probes into how design might find ways to mediate the incomprehensible and inaccessible landscapes that we have created and that we need to somehow take responsibility for. And although and through the kind of practices of gardening and cultivating and an attentiveness to material language, there's an attempt to embrace these territories not as damaged objects to be repaired or remediated, but as kind of complex places that can be rediscovered, that can engender alternative forms of inhabitation. And so I suppose as a kind of conclusion, the kind of series of works that I have shown today have a broader aim, which is to try to engage technology without technological positivism, ecology without ecological hysteria, and modes of working that attempt to navigate these kind of courses that operate through the intertwinements as well as the estrangements and the simultaneous affinities and antagonisms between what we used to call nature and ourselves. Thank you.
Hi. Thanks so much for the invitation. I've long admired what you guys do in landscape here at Harvard. I'm a long-time listener, first-time caller, as it were. Let me get settled here. This will do. So, as Brad said in his intro, I'm what I call a speculative architect, which means I don't design buildings, have no real interest in doing so, but instead I work between documentary and fiction to explore the global and urban implications of emerging technologies. So for the next 20 minutes, I made a little film, and I want to talk about landscapes made for and by technology. I want to go behind the screen, beyond the fog of the cloud, to explore cities of networks, autonomous systems and mobile technologies, and think about them as a planetary scaled city of distributed landscapes. So we're going to take a little seat in a driverless taxi. We're going to drift through this near future city of the post-Anthropocene that for today we're going to call City Everywhere. And we're going to explore this condition of the post-Anthropocene, a condition where there is no longer a city and a country or a center and a periphery, but just this continuous urban form stretched across the entirety of the planet. To think about this idea that in the post-Anthropocene or in the context of robotic landscapes, we must rethink the notion of site or place or landscape and start to consider them as kind of distributed territories in some form. let's go. So I want to narrate a series of stories that form a portrait of this imaginary city of distributed landscapes, a city that's going to be stitched together from real sites that we visited with the nomadic research studio I run from London with another architect called Kate Davies, that's called Unknown Fields, but also the speculative film projects that I develop out of these conditions with my own Urban Futures think tank, Tomorrow's Thoughts Today. So let's tap our destination into our smartphones and buckle up as we travel from the center of this city everywhere out to its edges, which are inevitably scattered across the earth. So here we are in our driverless taxi, and we're seeing the world through the eyes of this machine. It's a world of point clouds and laser scans, and the smart city is sitting beside us, the operating system of the post-Anthropocene, and it smells of hard drives and fiber optics and Red Bull. And the electric motor hums and we rumble on quietly, and the city has invited us on this road trip across its technological skin. It's looking forward to showing us around, to visit the sites and structures made for and by its machines, sites of this planetary scaled city where nothing has escaped. And the city leans over and points out a structure out the window. And here in the distance, we can make out the tracery of markings scored across its surface. These aren't evidence of some ancient tribal culture or a forgotten relic of the Nazca lines, but these are the traces of the new tribes of the digital, or the animal tracks of the orbiting satellites above. So this is on the right is a satellite calibration target. It's a machine vision graphic that's etched into the ground of the city and supports the precision that this whole system of technology relies on. So these patterns were created to give these cameras something on which to calibrate their lenses.
That was in the Sydney Morning Herald. Sandy Island was actually found on Google Earth.
And this, as we keep on traveling, is Sandy Island. So in the Pixel Sea, we see just off the coast of Australia this collection of dark pixels, GPS coordinates, hyperlinks, and stories. It was originally charted by the whaling ship Velocity as a kind of a doubtful landmass. Perhaps it was a volcanically ejected pile of pumice that was seen drifted on the horizon, but this cartographic apparition remained visible on Google Earth until an Australian research vessel confirmed its non-existence during a 2012 expedition to survey the ocean floor. So up until that point, to a world of Google explorers and hyperlink adventurers, this landscape was just as real as any other place they visited online. So in this world of the post-Anthropocene and robotic landscapes, places and spaces exist in the mediums through which we experience them, and then in turn they become just as real as any physical landscape. This is our collection of landscapes in the new city. The post-Anthropocene operates on this strange Borgesian one-to-one digital model of the world, and the pixel is now the territory, and the driverless car is our vessel. And the city turns to us and smiles with a grin of server racks and silica. And our car is now scanning the landscape. It shoots out a laser at 1 million times a second and reflects off the world and renders it as this point cloud that we're driving through. So the city everywhere is actually made for this way of seeing. This is the new nature that we're all designing for, the new nature that we're all inhabiting. It's no longer based on our own patterns of vision or occupation anymore, but we've all been displaced from the center of the post-Anthropocene, and we drift through this pixel sea. And And the first characters we meet in City Everywhere are the hipsters of the post-Anthropocene. So these young ravers here in the city have reimagined their fashion cycles to follow at the rate of Moore's law, this new nature of point clouds, or the latest phone model or software update, rather than a change in season. And they adorn themselves in anti-facial recognition makeup, and new camouflage textiles, and a new hoodie that's designed to be invisible to the scanning technologies of the City Everywhere. Because camouflage has always reflected our changing relationship to nature, and now this is the landscape that we're responsive to, where the iridescent textiles reflect the light of CCTV laser scanners to create glitches and distortions. And as we keep driving, we see the city's drones drift above us. And these are the new inhabitants that the city of technology is being designed for. And here we're seeing the city through their eyes. So in machine vision systems, a fiducial is what we call a recognizable marker that's placed in the environment for navigation and image processing. And now we're seeing the emergence of a kind of a fiducial architecture as the pixel is reshaping our cities. We're seeing structures designed to be read by the eyes of machines rather than our own vision and patterns of occupation. And these technologies now define our designs and experiences, and the architectures and landscapes of City Everywhere become like green screen studios or blank geometries of calibration marker ornamentation, and the world becomes a screen lying in wait for the premiere of 1 million animated movies. And everyone in the post-Anthropocene has a collection of pet drones. These are the new creatures of this city, and they've become as ubiquitous as pigeons. And all the dogs are walked by drones now. Think of the time saving, the smart city says. And here, a network of drones monitor the wayward youth of a London council estate. And we watch as a young girl has hacked and decorated her own drone, and she uses it to pass notes to her boyfriend trapped in the tower opposite. And like kids in an old-fashioned classroom, they scribble notes on paper, they ball it up and they stow it away in their drones and send them back and forth. So in this near-future city landscape, drones form both agents of state surveillance, but they also become co-opted as the aerial vehicles through which two teens fall in love. And here we see another drone armed just with a dildo that disrupts a Russian parliamentary session. And another drone zips overhead en route to attack a village in a country half a world away. And that's really what these drone technologies are, just ways of collapsing landscape, way of remotely operating, connecting a site in one landscape with a site in another. And the city says we should follow the Amazon Prime drone that's zipping about above us. We can follow it back to the Amazon warehouse, the city says. That's where we keep, well, everything, says the city. So stretching out before us now is another kind of landscape, the endless shelves and storage bins of the Amazon fulfillment center. So Amazon bookshelves are stacked based on a complex sorting algorithm that's engineered around sales frequencies and buying patterns. And here we watch as Amazon robots rush through the stacks, navigating from book to book, filling orders by following the most efficient route generated for them by their navigational programming. And this is the library of City Everywhere. This is another kind of robotic landscape that's not organized around systems that we might recognize, like the Dewey Decimal System, but by buying habits and aggregated data sets. It's a library that isn't organized for us, but a space that's organized by digital logics and inhabited by bodies repurposed as machines. And as we drive deeper into the city, we see that These are the human machines of the production line. This is who we are in the post-Anthropocene. In a way, a lot of us are just passengers in this planetary scaled robot. And we, perhaps, are the real robots of our new landscapes of technology, where our bodies are matched in speed to the conveyor belt that turns in front of it, and our thumbs evolve to swipe across digital screens. This is us in City Everywhere, where every meaningful moment can somehow be counted and measured, and technology is handcrafted by a million fingers scattered around the world. And as we drive deeper into the city, we see that what we're doing to biology, what we did to technology production, we now do to biology. In City Everywhere, we make our own fish matched to the color of our eyes or to our shoes.
My mother used to tell me that I had the most beautiful eyes. I liked hearing that. I like it when people look into my eyes, when they stare at them. Royal blue with an amber halo.
Structures of the digital world, of autonomous systems and robotic structures, have extraordinary implications on material experience. So these are the architectures that lie behind the screen and beyond the fog of the cloud. They're the physical outputs of our digital engagement with the world. So what if we were to design with these systems to make design decisions not based on how a device might slide into our pockets or make a seamless aluminium edge, but based on the events they set in motion across the other side of the world? What would be a new tech aesthetic for the post-Anthropocene? And now we leave the lights of the city behind and we drive on into the dust, and we see the rhythms of the human conveyor belt in Madagascar. So 70% of our precious gemstones come from the illegal gem fields, where it's cheaper to pay 20 men in rice than it is to maintain and fuel a mechanical conveyor belt. So a hidden black market supply chain connects these lawless mine sites to the jewelry stores, hip-hop music videos, and celebrity red carpets of a city like this one. So for the jewelry of City Everywhere, we have used the amount of rice the human conveyor belt consumes in a day to manufacture a single synthetic gemstone. In a lab in Russia, the rice is subjected to intense heat and pressure to produce a diamond that we've used in a gold hip-hop tooth, to make a music video that embodies the systems through which these worlds are intimately and profoundly connected. And as we keep on driving, we come to the city's energy fields. And these are only revealed when we see them from above in our drone, and we drift through Chile and Bolivia, past the evaporation ponds of the world's largest lithium mines. So this is the landscape behind the scenes of the batteries that power our cities. 70% of the world's lithium is here. And if the future is electric, if the future is Elon Musk and his Tesla-fueled dreams and his solar-paneled roofs, then the future is buried here, beneath the salt flats of Bolivia. But it's not part of the latest tech keynote, it's not part of the dominant media narrative. And as we keep on driving from a clearing in the point cloud mist, we see the cavernous landscapes of these so-called ephemeral technologies. So in the massive mining excavations scattered at the edge of the world, our digital realities begin and end their lives. We each have a bit of the gold from this site in the technologies in our pockets. And the digital models of these landscapes are linked live to the fluctuations of metal prices on the stock market. So as explosive diggers and drills have replaced the slow erosion of rivers and earthquakes, we're scoring our economy into the archaeological record, a chronicle of the digital permutations that drive the modern world. And in the landscape, we see vehicles like this one, which is just like ours that we're driving through with no drivers, just systems. And mining trucks rumble up mountains and carve soil along GPS trails generated by the fluctuations of a coked-up trader across the other side of the world. And our journey through the city is taking us across the planet, through landscapes at the scale of the pixel, affecting landscapes at the scale of canyons and continents. And a city like this one cannot be described as a single point on the map. Our technologies cast shadows across the earth. And we pack up all the objects and materials produced in these sites and we send them off in ships. And this is the computer-controlled container fleet of the mega shipping industry that now navigates autonomously based on GPS satellites. So the ship captain and the portside crane operators have been made obsolete and are just passengers in the machine, their bodies repurposed as a component in the landscape-scaled robot that stacks the containers ready for transport, bringing our goods all the way home. And finally, the city brings us to the shores of its radioactive lake. So this is some of the first footage of the toxic waste that sits beside the world's largest rare earth mineral refinery. And we take a selfie with our phones, and we see our reflection in the mirrored screen because the material to polish its glass and run its software comes from this very lake. And collapsed together in this black mirror, we see ourselves and this black earth. And from this black sludge, we've made a vase for the smart city to thank it for its tour. It's a set of vases made from the amount of radioactive waste created in the production of 3 iconic tech objects: an iPhone, a MacBook, and a Tesla electric car battery. This is the material aesthetic for technology born of the earth. It's a Ming vase for the city everywhere generation. So as we come to the end of our tour, we finish in another kind of landscape to meet the creatures that we've left behind. So if we understand and can map all of these systems, then perhaps we can begin to reimagine them, to start to design relational objects, designing networks and systems that deliberately reverberate across multiple sites and times, projects that might truly be made in everywhere, where landscape design and gadget design collapse into one seamless project. So here in this project that we're finishing on, we hear a bird song, a chorus for the new world of City Everywhere. I released 80 canaries into a sealed gallery space, and slowly I increased the levels of carbon dioxide in the gallery in line with predicted increases if the post-Anthropocene continues without change. It's an interior space as a model of accelerated climate change. And I act as a pollution DJ, and against the rise in CO2, and you can see on the right, I narrate the predicted developments of technology, the wonders of possible progress. So in this new city, in this new landscape of technology, the birds are no longer singing. If we listen, we're strolling towards a strange but silent spring. So as we finish our drive, hopefully we see that it's important to travel to these landscapes both in fiction and in reality. And we see that our technologies, our buildings, our spaces are formed from a planetary scale machine and infrastructure so large that it's become invisible. A machine so often disguised, ignored, or forgotten behind the gloss of the screen or the seamless aluminium edge, the glare of the pixel or the tweets of my internet-connected fridge. And we must move beyond this dominant media narrative of technology or the rhetoric of the new, the easier, the autonomous, the optimized systems which are simply going to make our life just better in all possible ways, and start seeing them as much more complex. And if through a speculative and literal immersion in this complexity, then perhaps we can imagine how, as designers, we can begin to instigate new cultural relationships with the inevitable byproducts of industry and technology. From all these landscapes on the edge of the world, our new Anthropocene reality begins and ends its life. Thanks.
Very tough act to follow. Fascinating. I wish I could make videos like that. I'm Earl Ellis. I'm a professor of geography and environmental systems at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. I'm an ecologist who studies human transformation of ecosystems, so obviously this is exactly the kind of thing I'm interested in. And I'm just going to start off by trying to summarize my take on the main things I just encountered here. And these are all things that are relatively new to me, except maybe Rob's stuff, who is operating a little closer to home. Maybe I should operate in reverse. So Liam's work, the planetary city, kind of the post-Anthropocene, and I wonder if I would call that the post-Anthropocene. It's more like the deep Anthropocene would be more my thinking. We're kind of moving there with humans in the picture. But that a fascinating picture of what if machines kind of really are the agent of society. And a question I think we might ask later as we get together on questions is really the technology running us, or is it's just a symptom of society itself running people? And then with Kathy, the big take home I got was this idea of really two ideas. One was how to connect the environment through sensors with a direct human experience, kind of as you said, the material embodiment of information rather than just looking at a data display or a text or something like that, to feel the environment in new ways. I thought that was really interesting. And also the idea of reimagining the garden with a robot as gardener, which is something that Brad and Laura Martin and I have been talking about as well. So it's really interesting to see that kind of embodied there. And then, so Rob, one of the first things you said that was kind of interesting, this idea of humans as being contaminated by nature rather than the other way around. I thought that was kind of interesting. And the idea of the need for a robot wilderness. Which again is something that we've been talking about, is this idea that robots might create wilderness, and that we need to think in terms of control versus influence, which I thought that was an interesting division of things. So I'm not usually moderating a lot of discussion, so I'm going to try to I'll bring up a few questions that I thought were the kind of questions that I thought needed to be asked and answered. But then I want to leave as much time as possible for questions from everyone else. So one of the questions for Rob originally, but I think maybe everybody, all three of you have some real thoughts on this, was you brought up you differentiated this idea of control from this idea of influence. And you did make a strong effort to define this difference between control and influence. But from my view, it wasn't completely clear what the difference was. I see this more as a kind of entanglement, where the line between intentionality or some really clear guidance system and just things, forcing each other to change in some kind of interactive way, it's not clear. But if you have a clear view of it, I would love to hear a clarification of what that difference is.
Well, I mean, I think you're right in general that when we set up kind of an opposition like that, it's a rhetorical device. So typically if you have two things and you oppose them, the reality is probably that there are going to be a bunch of things that exist on a spectrum between them rather than a truly stark division. But I think I think generally I would say that the difference for me is that influence is kind of merely a matter of having had impact. Like if you've influenced something, you've had some kind of impact on it. Whereas control is more a matter of being able to direct it. And so it's kind of a question of where does the will lie? Is the will kind of lie in the controlling agent, or does the will lie in the thing itself? So that'd be my.
And I want to hear what you two have to say about this if you're interested in answering that. But I have one quick follow-up question on that. Does it take control to create wilderness? Because wilderness, as we know, right, is something that people have to at least create theoretically.
Yeah, I think you can create. I kind of didn't talk about this in great depth, but this is why I thought it was important to clarify that something can be generated under conditions of control and yet not be controlled. So it's possible to, I think we consistently have created systems that escape our control, or that because they have the capacity to kind of grow and evolve on their own, they have a genuine agency that's not just carrying out the intentions of the creator.
Okay, I'll go. I mean, I think control is a kind of concept that I associate most with modernism and modernization, and also with the rise of technology is the idea that things can be controlled, because control is a real discourse when you're creating electronics, when you're creating computers. So control is part of the culture of automation, part of the culture of standardization, of modernization. And I think, though, when it comes to questions of landscape, I think the question of control is a kind of, at best, a kind of cognitive dissonance, where we think we're in control, or wherever we try to impose control, we find that these kind of aberrant geographies kind of emerge, and much to our dismay. I'm thinking also of kind of things like dams and other kinds of mechanisms of landscape control that in the early part of the 20th century were really kind of celebrated as our control of the landscape, our control of nature, and what we're finding is that biotic systems are really operate through the opposite, that they operate through a kind of the kind of far from equilibrium, the kind of lack of control, and so control has been, as a human species, as a modern species, I think one of our kind of or the idea of control and the desire to control, I think, has been one of the real kind of, I guess, problems of modernization.
Double-edged sword.
Yeah, and so, and I think what's interesting is we're starting to work as designers with concepts of of non-control, of loosening control. And that's where it starts to get interesting, where we start to work with emergent systems, with complex systems, which actually operate through principles that are kind of lack of control, or as Kevin Kelly says, kind of out of control, and embrace that as actually a kind of much more powerful way to kind of, let's say, design or work with systems.
That's something that that Charles Waldheim, I think, was calling distanced authorship, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe it's useful to think about control versus influence in the context of your first question about post-Anthropocene versus de-Anthropocene, right? Because, I mean, I guess my use of the term is to be provocative, I suppose, but to say that the Anthropocene puts us at the center of these systems, but for the most part, we've relieved ourselves of such responsibility, and we now have influence over these systems, but the things at the core making the decisions are actually autonomous networks and systems, right? In the way that you know, the ship captain that I describe is just babysitting this giant beast, which is being controlled by a set of navigational programming systems that we designed the fitness criteria for, but are now just running out and doing their own thing, right? So maybe that again is kind of distance influence, but that's what I mean, I guess, by post-anthro is just post us as center, where we've employed software systems to do a lot of this stuff for us, right?
I've seen the term technosphere, which gets used in different ways, but I've also heard it used that way, that the emergence of the technosphere as a kind of a new system that it even controls us. I'm not sure I completely buy into that idea. I see more, in a sense, technology getting blamed as the messenger for what we actually do to each other. You know, before there was the machine to do the work, there was a slave, perhaps. And so there's the social organization, the social process is playing out with new tools.
Yeah, I
But
mean,
it's really the social process.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you can separate technology from culture, right? Like these systems are just exaggerations of our own. But equally, I think that there's a certain kind of distance that we've put in place for ourselves, and it's that distance which I think is intriguing, right? But equally, you know, like in the same way that, like, I mean, none of these systems solve problems; they just exaggerate problems that already exist. So they're equally they're extensions of ourselves, and I guess that's part of your critique of the technosphere as well. You know, they're not out there just kind of roaming around and designing our worlds for us. We've coded our own behaviors and biases and subjectivities into them. But now, to a certain extent, they're running out and acting on those codes.
That is a perfect setup for what I'll make my final question. So we were exploring this idea of the robot as gardener, right? The robot is, let's pretend that we can do this thing. I don't think we can do it really quite yet, but it's plausible that we're going to be able to do this soon, and it's going to, typically what we can do, we do at some point. And so you've got this robot garden. I'm going to add another dimension, something that David Klein has been bringing to the table too, this idea of deep learning, where the objectives of these robot gardeners may be programmed, right? The goal is, and I think the goal we've been talking about is the autonomy of wildlife, say. Other species will no longer be under our control. Take them away from our control. That's the ultimate win for the robot. But the robot gets to figure out how to do it. We're not going to tell it how to play the game. It's going to change the game in its own way. What do you think about that? Is that just the grounds for doomsday, or is there something interesting there? This new entity might do things a little differently than we do, provide a little more space for things beyond our control. I think that's the idea. In a world that we kind of do tend to take over and at least the very least influence everything, how do you create space where we don't?
I think we, for all the knowledge we have, we know surprisingly little about things and about biology, about nature itself. And so I think that, I think that kind of just under-specifying goals as opposed to over-specifying them, as long as you're willing to accept the consequences of the experiment. I think, in my mind, would be a worthwhile experiment because I think also we might learn something because I think that we don't know everything. And in fact, the more that we start to learn about the world, even with kind of sensing technologies, we realize that we know even less. And our entire kind of systems of knowledge are actually being put into doubt the more knowledge we gain. So this is kind of paradox that we exist in. And so I think that there's interesting experiments with machine learning and robotics for sure.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think I don't know. Like, I think robotic gardeners are here, right? They're called combine harvesters, which is part of my way of answering that question. And like, we do this thing with Unknown Fields where we travel around and visit lots of crazy landscapes, and we're trying to trace the shadows of urbanism, right? And we haven't yet found a point on the planet that isn't somehow touched or shaped by those systems, right? So if we talk about like a point on the map outside of the constraints of control, or at least when those degrees of control are somehow relaxed, I don't know, I just don't see it anywhere, right? Like either a landscape has been sacrificed in the service of the production of that urban movement, or it's somehow influenced by it. Like either way, they're touched. And my point of City Everywhere is just to describe this condition where every millimeter on the planet has somehow been manipulated. So I don't see any spaces. I don't know where they would occur or how. Right?
But yeah, I agree. I think maybe not exactly with what you're saying, but generally with what you're saying. But what if the creation of the space is what the robot is supposed to do? The system is designed to eliminate the human influence. That's what I was trying to get at with this idea. If the robot is gardener and the goal of the robot, the robot wins when it's able to eliminate the human influence.
Yeah, I think I saw a science fiction movie about that, right?
It's somewhat science fiction, but we make the smart city to serve us.
Yep.
What if we made this smart garden to serve the other species?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I think like I'm just scrambling to try and find an analogy, but yeah, like where you actually program us out deliberately of the system, like if Chernobyl was a deliberate algorithm to kind of
I think we don't know
remove
how
it from the
the
equation.
robot would solve this.
I think it would end in a kind of horror movie.
It's a real possibility.
in my
Yeah.
mind. Or I think I've seen that Star Trek episode.
I mean, we did we've been to Pripyat. I mean, Rob showed it, and it is as close as we get to a post-human landscape. But I mean, it's kind of a cliche in landscape terms now, isn't it? Right. But it is kind of one of the rare examples of a landscape that's taken over. But now it's a theme park, right? You can buy tickets to go and see it, and now it's being curated as a giant museum because hundreds of photographers across the years have gone there and moved the little teddy bear just right, and arranged a pile of children's gas masks in a certain way to make a photograph. So slowly this kind of landscape without people has been curated as a museum to wilderness, right?
It's a kind of scary outcome.
So I mean, we could kind of instigate these landscapes, but we're still going to find a way to make them our own again, right?
Rob, you have any thoughts before we go to
I mean, I don't think the situation that you're describing actually removes humans, or kind of, I don't think it permits us to abrogate responsibility or kind of alleviates us of responsibility for the outcome. In that case, like to me, it seems like the situation you're describing is a robotic system whose ends are still organized by humans. And to me, at that point, then like the question of ends shifts back to being a political one, and very much the responsibility for how you make that decision is a human responsibility.
All right. Are there any questions out there from the audience? There's nothing urgent. I could certainly come up. How much more time do we have? 30 minutes, okay.
Stayed on.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
Well, how much time would you like me to take for this section? No, 15, okay.
I mean, I'll come back to your post-human question, right? Like, I mean, we're super interested in data centers right now as being another kind of, as being a landscape where we've been excluded and happily removed, right? But they're also landscapes of intense culture, right? Like this is the contemporary cultural typology. You know, we no longer have the great library or the grand cathedral or the great museum. We have the data center, which for the most part are extraordinary scaled landscapes of intense climate control and air cycling systems that occasionally have, you know, an IT guy with a builder's crack roaming around replacing a server. So they're, you know, that's a landscape that's been where we've been optimized out, I suppose. And there's a bunch of them. I mean, the Amazon Fulfillment Center is almost one of those same landscapes that is still human and part of us, but we no longer belong.
Yeah, I mean, I would tend to agree with you, Rob, that there's no way to build an intelligent system that without, at some level, having some goals built in. So there has to be some goals. And the second you start doing that, the goal-setting process is inherently a human, political, cultural process. There's no way to get around that completely. So it's only about the rules. What kind of rules do you play by? And I would say that when you look at the rules that conservation and preservation strategies have to work by, you're adding many more levels of human culture and human influence and human control rather than just a very, very clear and simple one. So in a sense, it exposes the politics more by going back just to the goals, forget about the means, just the ends are part of the program. The rest is learned by, the machine figures everything else out. Do you think that just ultimately is a mistake? I mean, you did advocate for robot gardeners. How do you program these things? How do they program them in this way that doesn't just become a fig leaf for some human agenda, but rather really does help the other species? It's a hard question.
It's a good question.
Yeah, it's one I've been thinking about too. Oh, we have a question. Russell, okay.
No.
Oh, I got it. We're talking a lot about future scenarios, and Liam, I see your work as very much a cautionary tale, and Kathy, your work really does span a really interesting range of looking at prehistories and thinking about future possibilities of the landscape. But Rob, I think that you probably have a lot to say about this when you spoke about designers as being really bad futurists, and how we're really at this moment of thinking about how we're either designing or interpreting technologies and how they're shaping our current landscape or how they might project into the future. And so I thought maybe you could speak about very bad futurists.
Well, yeah, it's definitely something that I've been thinking about and working on, particularly in this project for the last few years called Wicked Ecologies that I've been doing with a colleague in California, Brett Milligan, which has been, I don't know that it's convinced me at all of like, it has me very convinced that the problem is real, that designers do tend to be kind of naive about the future, and that we tend to be very simplistic in the way that we approach what might happen in the future, and that even at just kind of like the small scale of like you think of kind of a typical professional design process, I think for me, like a site analysis is a kind of rudimentary futurism because it kind of looks at a landscape and it says that this is what I think is happening in it, and now I'm going to go and design based on kind of my beliefs about what's likely to happen to it in the future, even though those are very intuitive rather than kind of informed by some kind of model or some kind of simulation or some kind of rigorous technique for approaching future possibilities for that site. So I'm very convinced that that's a problem, but none of the work that I've done so far has convinced me that I have any idea what the answer to the problem is.
I could say that it's been proven that nobody's a good futurist.
Yeah.
There really isn't good futurism. We usually, if you look at forecasts of the future, they're mostly wrong. It's remarkable how wrong they tend to be.
But that's the problem though. Like we shouldn't be talking about futures or futurism or futurists as people that predict anything, right? Like I think prediction is just a little side effect of futures, right? Like actually the role of the futurist is to play out multiple futures, not predict any single future, right? Like, and that's the value of the speculative project is that we prototype possibilities, and that's what's great about some science fiction. Like we can talk about, Arthur C. Clarke predicted the geostationary orbit, or Neuromancer predicted cyberspace and the internet, but actually the role that they play is much more significant in opening up possibilities within the present moment, right? And I think that's what the Futurist Project is actually, using the distancing lens of the future to look back in on the decisions that we're making today, right? So to judge any kind of Futurist project against their predictions, I think is problematic and inherently, flawed, and like we're in trouble, yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with that wholeheartedly. I mean, I think the approach that I've been most interested in is a kind of narrative one, whose intention is not, as you say, it's not to predict the future so much as it is to ask what might be possible, which goal is not to decide which things are most possible, but rather to decide which things do we want.
Yeah.
And then what do we work towards?
Yeah. I mean, that's like 1984 is actually about 1948, right? And the idea is to somehow construct a condition where we're more informed about the steps we need to take to get to a more preferable future, and exploring what that preferable future might be, rather than trying to predict it and then design for it, right? Yeah.
That's actually the question that I was going to ask is, often we talk about these things as, technology development is sort of being inevitable, right? It's just something passed down and it's just going to happen. Things are going to become much more industrialized to the every corner of the earth. But, I kind of wanted to ask the panel, I try to ground that somehow. I mean, population won't, is going to, it's projected to top out. It's not going to continue to exponentially grow. We'll learn how to get more efficiencies out of the land that we use for harvesting. So I guess maybe it's a personal question, but where do you think where do you think things can go, or where do you think you want things to go, given that we really have a say in that? It's not just some God-given technology progress.
No, I hate it, man.
Okay. Maybe I'll start to try to answer that question. I think if I'm going to try to remember this reference properly, but I think it was Freud in Civilization and Its Discontents, where he talks about the progress of technology and the incredible power of that, but still our own kind of societal relations actually don't move at the same speed as technology, and I think that I hate to bring this up, but we can find, even the events in the past week, we find that we have not really, society does not progress as the same speed as technology. And in fact, it may never, we may find that we don't progress societally at all, which might be our kind of horrible realization. And so I think that that's why kind of in some of the work that we've been doing, I think things, trying to cultivate things like relations, empathy, a kind of consciousness of the environment or of other species or other kind of life forms is still the kind of primary part of the project, no matter where, how far the technology progresses. I think it's still the kind of, our social relations and our relations between ourselves, our environment and other species are still, no matter what, how far the technology has progressed, I think that's still the kind of project that we need to be working on.
Yeah, I use the phrase that the future isn't something that just washes over us like water, right? Like we're all active parts of shaping and defining it. But with technology, it's slightly different, right? Like we're far less active consumers of technology than we should be. For the most part, people are plowing billions of dollars into the development of these systems. There was no real consensus about whether these systems were the ones that we should be investing in, right? Like, take the driverless car, right? If you're an architect or urbanist and you're not interested in the way that this thing is going to totally change the nature of what a city is, then you're in total denial. But the genie's already out of the bottle, right? Like there's billions of dollars that have already been spent on this thing, and it's coming, whether we like it or not, right? So, and the question is how, as designers, we can actually be a part of that process earlier on, rather than just kind of waiting in line for the next iPhone to come out. So, I think that's the real struggle or challenge of our generation is to try and wrestle back what I describe as before culture technologies, right? Things that have evolved and have come to market before we've had the cultural capacity to understand what their implications and possibilities might be. And yeah, I think that's the real challenge.
What do I want? Single payer healthcare? No, but if I tie it to the talk, maybe just to make that a more limited question, I think the thing that seems really important and valuable to me about robot wilderness is that I think there is this very real condition or experiential necessity for encounters with otherness if we're going to care for otherness. And I think like the statistics you were presenting, for instance, or the statistics that Liam presented in terms of species extinction, those should make clear the urgency of the problem. But for me, unless there is real opportunity for encounter with the world outside ourselves as other, I don't think we can learn to care for it properly. And unless we can learn to care for it properly, I don't think we can restrain ourselves and govern ourselves in the right way to protect it, or to enable it to kind of grow on its own. Yeah, and so I guess the whole reason that I think like the project of influence versus control is important is because I think if we confine ourselves to only seeing kind of these unspoiled spaces or spaces that appear to not have our influence on them as other, then we kind of remove the potential for those experiences.
Yeah, that's why I really enjoy your robotic wilderness. Just because I don't think the solution to my version of City Everywhere is like this kind of retreat to the hills to raise chickens and pigs and live off grid, right? Like, we've created this world for ourselves and we're not going to let it leave. It's too shiny and glossy and fun. But really what the possibilities are is actually thinking of how we kind of negotiate and work within those systems in new ways, how we can actually start to engineer them like in my context, engineering supply chain networks and productive landscapes for things other than the exploitation of cheap labor markets or cheap resources, right? But we can actually design a supply chain for other kind of productive outputs, right? And I think that recognition of complexity, as opposed to the binary oppositions of nature and technology, I think is a future.
Yep. I think there's an enormous amount of excess in the system right now. And I think there's often these kind of arguments that it couldn't be any other way because it's so efficient. And I think that's actually wildly unrealistic. It's just, this is why I think it's political, is because it's a question of where is that excess directed and who has the power to direct it.
Yeah. This guy's going to kill himself unless he asks a question.
Yeah, like I've been well here. First, thanks for all the 3 presentations. I think they were amazing and super refreshing for the environment here. My question is just, a little bit connected to politics. Like, I know that we see it as like, city everywhere and all that, but my question is like between rural and city, and coming like from last week and from all the elections that happened here, and how, even that we have technology everywhere, we do see, at least in the US, very, 2 different like conditions, very, very different in a way. And I'm just curious of like, if you think there's like an agency on technology and on all this that's going on, like what would be, if you think there's like a big difference, or you think that's like seamless and like regardless of the politics and regardless of what happens, like if it's the same or not? I don't know if something like that.
What happened last week?
No, I don't want to politicize it. I'm just curious, like, because we did say it like that.
No, like what I was saying before, like you can't separate technology from culture, right? So, like we haven't invented a robotic system of politics. Like, maybe we have. I don't know.
Yeah, you might have missed the news Friday.
But like, all these systems are actually, like I say, they're fraught with their own biases and contradictions, right? Which means that we can misuse them and use them for ways in which they weren't intended. That's not to say we should ban them and restrict them in any way, but we should acknowledge and recognize ourselves in those processes, right? And we can spin these things to say or do anything we want, right? So the same technology that allows a drone to, in our project, fly around a theater and broadcast the sounds of a band playing live on stage, also bombs the hell out of people in Afghanistan, right? The box cutter, which opens my mail, hijacks a plane and crashes into a World Trade Center. The technology just plays out in the way that we let it, and it plays out in the way that we ourselves have constructed the world. So I don't think you can talk about technology separate from these things.
So this talk about wilderness is really interesting, and I'm trying to, I feel like I detect like a kind of opposition of control versus wilderness, that there's an almost divinity in the wilderness idea, and this idea of emergence being something that is, superior to control, I think that's, that's treacherous a little bit, because I do think that when you try to control something, that's actually probably the most powerful moment of encountering the other, in a way, of like nature, of the kind of power and uncertainty that's out there. If you really sort of try to master something, it always gets loose, So it's like, if you're trying to, create a positive sort of ecosystem, that's really difficult. Or if you're trying to control the LA River, in the end, they rip out all the concrete because they don't like it. So there's like ultimate volatility, I think, in actually that engagement. So I think that I wonder if, just a question for Rob to sort of, do you have this other, are you sort of elevating emergence? Or how do you sort of elevate it in this context?
I would definitely disagree with some of the premises of the question. So I would not say that control is bad and wilderness is good. I would say that they're different, which is, I think, very different from saying that one is good and the other is bad. But I think also, for me, if you kind of project the question back into the original context of, say, Emmanuel Levinas, so where he's talking about, for him, the other is you and a human, right? You and another human. Trying to control another human is maybe not the best kind of encounter to have, even if you could say in some ways it's a very fundamental encounter. And I think I would kind of then reproject that back towards the non-human other and say, yeah, there may be instances where that's the right kind of relationship to have, but I don't think just the fact that it's a fundamental encounter makes it necessarily an appropriate encounter to have.
The other option is, with the environment, not to control, is to give something else control. But that's the, whose grace are we under? If it's not our own, if we don't take responsibility.
Yeah, sure.
Is this a good time to close? Yeah. All right. Thank you for your great talk.
Yeah.
That means that one needs a drink.
They need several drinks, Alex.
I think the best things have already been said, so I'm fine. Do you want to say a few words? Yeah.
So I have a bunch of I have a bunch of rambling thoughts that I can put out there for everybody, because today was, and the people here are, it's definitely one of my, one of my deep interests, and getting everybody in this room was something I've been looking forward to for quite a while, and it didn't disappoint at all. There are a whole range of things brought up today. One of the first things that stood out in my mind was something that I think it keeps coming up in all the work in the lab, but also in the kind of theoretical framing of the work and the kind of reading behind it. But that is that there is very little precedent. And Alex brought this up in his project for the Salton Sea, that many of these projects they don't have this kind of deep precedent for them. And the other aspect that gets brought up in that is how, as designers, but also designers set within in a societal framework, how we begin to set up goals for how these systems begin to operate and how they begin to interface with the world. That kind of central question for me is one that keeps haunting me. It's one that we keep trying to understand exactly what are the outcomes for these, if we call them devices or infrastructures, beyond the kind of base goals that we set up for them. The other is this concept that I brought up in the opening remarks, and that is our role as designers in a world where we begin to decenter humanity. And this idea that all of our goals may start to kind of move away from this idea of human experience, which I think as designers we kind of place at the fore in many cases, but instead is just one of the aspects of a whole range of other outcomes, particularly when we begin to imagine other species involved in that, and even when those other species might even be forms of machine intelligence. There's a form of kind of goals that shift whenever humanity becomes one agent in a sea of other agents, and I think that came out in the presentations today in many different ways. But I find that another extremely interesting topic. It is one that also shifts for landscape architecture what we continually call the kind of, or we continually validate our work through this idea of the cultural project. And what then is the cultural project when we have all of these other kind of species involved? What are their cultures? How are we beginning to design for them? The other, if we're thinking about it along these terms, then there's a whole series of, in my opinion, projects to undertake that involve different, new and different ways of seeing the world. And these I think got brought up pretty poignantly in Kathy's work. And while she touched on a few of them, she brought up these ideas that I would call issues of epistemology and finding kind of new forms of truth. But this is these ideas of using these devices or infrastructures to connect in ways we've never connected before, building new composites, and then even compressing the physical and temporal spaces we work within. And in many ways, Kathy brought up the extraction exhibit, which, or installation, which takes these continental scale processes and brings them down to a scale that we can interact with. And I would say that these compressions of time and space are ones that we take for granted, but are happening continually around us, and we almost flippantly use those as mechanisms to visualize, understand, or manipulate our world. The other part about that is that while these become new ways of seeing, these technologies also are like physical and manifest in the world around us. And it's not just that these are new ways of seeing the world, these are whole new ways of operating in my mind. And in the same way that we're visualizing new connections, we are actually making these new connections. And I think that's something to keep in mind. The kind of last couple aspects with that is that I think what that brings up is that rather than just a new way of visualizing, it's really a way of connecting kind of our past ideas about design into a single collapse process. And that's the one that I think came out in everybody's work today, and that is this idea of observing, analyzing, and making propositions all in one swoop, right? And that feedback loop, which for us has been what we even just call our process of design, is in somehow being compressed into the millisecond, and it's being iterated out over trillions times a second. And that is another huge change in terms of how we are beginning to process and work within the world. So for me, there's a whole range of things that get brought up there. One of the other aspects in this kind of feedback loop is that what we might have taken in design as an idea about this kind of search for an epistemology becomes this mechanism where we actually have some form of an adaptive epistemology, and where truth is never something we're seeking, but it's always something evolving, and we're kind of always aiming to off in the distance. So I'll leave it with that. I want to thank all of our panelists. It's been, for me, a really great afternoon. Thank you, Justine. Thank you, Earl. And thank you for everyone here in attendance and people on the live stream. So thank you.